Regional 150, cleared for a straight-in ILS approach, runway 06.
Cleared, straight-in ILS, runway 06, Regional 150.
Regional 150, contact tower now on 119.9 over Mike. Regional 150, center. Regional 150, do you read?
This aircraft was equipped and certified for flight under IFR and instrument meteorological conditions. It carried a full complement of navigational and communication equipment, as well as weather radar, a differential global positioning system interfaced with a CD-ROM Canada Air Pilot display, and a fifth-generation digital ground proximity warning system, and a pilot with thousands of IFR hours who failed for only a brief moment to perceive what was going wrong. Since 1909, hundreds of Canadians have lost their lives in documented aviation accidents. Controlled flight into terrain accidents in commercial aviation account for the greatest number of passenger fatalities worldwide. And almost all CFIT accidents can be attributed to a lack of situational awareness. The purpose of this presentation is not to sensationalize the risks of flight. As we all know, flight remains one of the safest and most reliable modes of transportation available today. Rather, we hope to alert you to the conditions and risks specific to controlled flight into terrain, with the intention of improving your awareness of exactly where you are and what is going on around you during flight time. The majority of accidents involving professional pilots occur during a critical flight window. This window centers around the runway and extends to 2,000 feet above ground level, with proximity to mountainous terrain increasing the volatility. The window begins with the final approach fix and ends with the final segment of takeoff climb. This is where you find the maximum cockpit workload. Most CFITs occur on approach, approximately half occurring on a VOR DME approach, where there is a series of step-down altitudes. An additional burden is placed on regional and charter companies operating into remote and sometimes unfamiliar airports. This adds to the workload at a critical stage of flight and sets the stage for CFIT. Perhaps what is most discouraging and yet shows some promise is that controlled flight into terrain is, for the most part, absolutely preventable. The key to managing all of the risk factors within and outside of the critical flight window is situational awareness. Situational awareness is based on the integration of knowledge resulting from recurrent situation assessment on 3 levels: perception of situational elements, information integration, and projection of future status and actions of situational elements. The first level can be achieved by relatively inexperienced pilots, provided there is an absence of factors affecting information acquisition in general, such as distractions or fatigue. In the next level, incoming information is compared with pilot's knowledge, the result of years of experience. Similar patterns are recognized, helping pilots to quickly form a picture of the situation. This will assist in ongoing decision-making. This highly developed repertoire of pattern-oriented representations is better known as expertise. The last level embraces the concept of being ahead of the aircraft, which from a system safety point of view is the final objective. It is best described as the mental simulation of future system state and behavior in order to eliminate the element of surprise. How incoming data is assessed, compared, and integrated into a sense of the situation is the process of situational awareness. The specific elements that help you maintain situational awareness are experience and training, physical flying skills, cockpit resource management, spatial orientation, and health and attitude. Accident investigation confirms a direct correlation between situational awareness and prevention of CFIT. Pilots who recognize and maximize situational awareness skills automatically distance themselves from high-risk situations. There are 2 assets every pilot carries onto an aircraft. One is experience gained from practical knowledge, skills, or practice. the result of hours of observation or participation. The other is from hours of time logged in the cockpit or classroom, training for response to rare, abnormal, and emergency flight conditions. Flying the aircraft remains the #1 priority. A proficient pilot can devote less mental energy to flying the aircraft under all conditions, devoting more attention to other cockpit tasks. The efficient and effective coordination and application of the technical and human resources in the cockpit is a skill above and beyond the actual flying of the aircraft, and the means by which a pilot may achieve and maintain situational awareness. Pilots must have an ongoing knowledge of an aircraft's spatial orientation within the three-dimensional plane, as well as its position relative to terrain, navigational aids, airports, runways, and sometimes other aircraft in the chronology of the flight plan. Physical and emotional health affect pilots' perception and interpretation of environment and events. Subsequently, their ability to define the world around them becomes restricted. Fatigue, for example, has a detrimental effect on both physical and mental health. Conversely, a professional attitude has a positive effect on safety. Accident analysis has also shown that there is rarely one single contributing factor. Rather, an accident is preceded by a sequence of unrelated events, all linked together to form a chain that spell disaster. In fact, most CFIT accidents are preceded by a minimum of 4, and on the average, 6 distinct events, each one a recognizable warning sign that something is decidedly not right. However, if any single link in the chain of events can be identified and corrected, fate can be foiled. The most common clues that signal loss of situational awareness and the development of a chain of undesirable events can be grouped into the terrible 11. Incomplete communication, ambiguity, unresolved discrepancies, use of undocumented procedures, preoccupation or fixation, no one flying the aircraft, no one looking, confusion, deviation from SOPs, any violation of limits or regulations, and the failure to meet targets, which can include airspeed, altitudes, headings or approach minimums, or plans and procedures that are not completed are all indicators that something is wrong. Analyzing the components of situational awareness is a valuable exercise. However, reviewing actual accident scenarios promotes recognition of suspect events in what might deceptively appear to be normal flight procedure. The following collection of case studies will provide you with the opportunity to practice identifying the telltale signs of an error chain and which elements of situational awareness could have prevented the accident. In order to print a picture in color, it must first be separated into the primary color elements on different transparencies, which, when registered, create a perfect picture. In a sense, flying is no different. The world of physical sensation and balance is one overlay, our sight another, instruments present another segment of the picture, our charts yet another still. When they all register correctly, we get a perfect picture of where we are and where we are going. But should they fail to register? On September 26, 1989, a small twin-engine regional carrier with 2 crew and 5 passengers was en route on an IFR flight plan to Terrace, BC, an airport surrounded by high terrain. Earlier, the forecast had been for 2 miles visibility with a 12,000 and 25,000 foot broken ceiling. But on arrival, the crew found smoke rolling over the airport, reducing visibility. Another aircraft reported that a circling approach was still possible. The crew changed their approach plan during the descent from a holding pattern at 16,000 feet, resulting in an incomplete briefing and rushed approach. The aircraft descended rapidly to 1,000 feet above the final approach fix. Once at the MDA, the crew had only part of the airport environment in sight. The captain called for full flaps as the aircraft passed the MAP. descending while turning 180 degrees to align the aircraft with the runway. However, before the aircraft completed the turn, the captain lost sight of the runway. He called for a missed approach, raised the nose, brought the power levers forward, raised the gear, and called for flaps up. The aircraft started to climb, but the captain, affected by the acceleration and change of attitude, incorrectly perceived that they were pitching sharply nose up. After trimming the aircraft nose down, he misinterpreted the HSI display of the aircraft attitude as well and ignored the co-pilot's warning that they were descending. 22 seconds after calling for a missed approach, he flew the aircraft into the ground. This is an example of CFIT on overshoot, an instrument-rated pilot affected by a human factor that creates the illusion of extreme pitch-up. As a result, the pilot misjudged the pitch of his aircraft during a critical phase of flight, despite warnings from his co-pilot. The elements of situational awareness that were lacking were experience and training, physical flying skills, cockpit resource management, and spatial orientation. The clues that should have alerted the pilot to the construction of an error chain were ambiguity, fixation, confusion, violating regulations, and the failure to meet targets. In Joseph Heller's topical Catch-22, the lead character reasoned that when flying, a concern for one's own safety in the face of dangers that were real and immediate was the process of a rational mind. The catch-22, of course, was that anyone wanting to fly under dangerous conditions was indeed irrational and therefore not qualified to fly. But anyone who didn't want to fly under such conditions was obviously quite sane and therefore had to. A concern for one's own safety and those of your passengers is indeed a rational process, one that requires that you recognize your own personal limits and when to fly and when not to. On the 19th of April 1993, a pilot and 3 passengers were approaching Brampton Airport, Ontario, after a 4-day Florida Sun and Fun fly-in. At the time of the approach, the pilot had been solely responsible for all aspects of the flight since the departure for 11 hours in this 16 hours duty day. There was no evidence that the pilot had requested any weather information on the last leg of the flight. With only 54 hours of instrument meteorological condition flying experience, deteriorating weather conditions forced the pilot into IMC. The pilot requested an IFR clearance and was cleared to 3,000 feet vectored to the VOR DME-A approach for Brampton Airport. During the approach, the pilot flew through the radial, prompting the air traffic controller to issue the pilot the new vector to re-intercept. While the aircraft was descending to the MDA, the air traffic controller informed the pilot that he was still east of the desired radial. In the last radio transmission, the pilot indicated that he might be able to cancel IFR and asked the ATC to stand by. The controller assumed the pilot had acquired visual reference during the descent and did not issue a safety alert when the aircraft was last seen at 1,500 feet. The aircraft was never established on the final approach radial and continued to descend below both the final approach fixed crossing altitude and minimum descent altitude before reaching the FAF. 4 miles northwest of the airport, the aircraft struck the terrain, killing the pilot and injuring the 3 passengers. Although the runway was visible, an aircraft was flown into the ground during a visual approach at night because the pilot did not realize the aircraft was descending. The elements of situational awareness addressed in this case were experience and training, cockpit resource management, spatial orientation, and health and attitude. His state of fatigue probably triggered fixation and confusion, which resulted in a failure to meet targets. As any magician won't tell you, it's easy to make things disappear. Sleight of hand is not the process of illusion, but rather a function of eye-hand coordination. The eyes of the audience are carefully focused, then distracted. while the magician's hands work in well-rehearsed coordination, creating the real magic, making things reappear. On the 10th of March 1993, a scheduled domestic flight left from Timmins to Moosonee with 2 pilots and 2 passengers. It was cleared for approach at Moosonee at 21:21 hours. There were several liabilities from the outset. Neither crew member had received night training on that type of aircraft. This was the first time they had flown the twin-engine craft at night, and it was also the first time the co-pilot had flown into Moosonee. The aircraft descended from its cruising altitude of 7,000 feet to the temporary altitude restriction of 5,000 feet. The crew elected to fly the VOR runway 24 approach and reported on the 061 radial of the VOR at 5 nautical miles outbound. Shortly after the intercept, the crew initiated a descent toward the 440 feet minimum descent altitude. During the descent, the aircraft broke through the lowest cloud layer at 900 feet, approximately 9.2 miles from the VOR. Both pilots now had the runway in sight, so the captain advised his co-pilot that he was changing to a visual approach and would proceed inbound at 700 feet. Shortly afterward, the captain initiated the before landing check and selected the landing gear down. There was no approach briefing conducted by the crew, including who would monitor the altimeter. This was also the first time this crew flew together. With no lights below or to either side for height reference, the captain flew the aircraft with reference to the runway lights. During a condition of black hole illusion, he continued to descend until the aircraft struck trees and crashed 7 miles northeast of the airport. The aircraft was destroyed by the impact and fire. The co-pilot received fatal injuries. The captain and passengers were seriously injured. The conditions that contributed to the catastrophic end to Flight 1602 were lack of experience and training, cockpit resource management, and spatial orientation. Because of poor communication, the responsibility of monitoring the altimeter was never assigned. No one was looking inside. While fleeing from Crete, the novice aviator Icarus became fixated by the sun, determined to achieve a similar status in the heavens. As he approached, the heat melted the wax bonding the feathers to his wings. There is much to learn from Icarus's untimely demise in the Aegean. Any preoccupation that detracts from the priority of flying can result in consequences that are anything but mythological. On December 16, 1991, the crew of a small twin-engine regional aircraft took off from Mayo on a return night flight to Whitehorse, Yukon Territories. The minimum operational cruising altitude for Mayo to Whitehorse was specified as 9,300 feet. However, a flight plan was filed for 7,500 feet under VFR, since there was cloud cover at 9,000 feet and they did not have enough fuel to meet the criteria of IFR. Following initial climb, the crew leveled off at 5,500 feet and set a course for Whitehorse with the intention of climbing to their final altitude. Suddenly, a passenger seated just behind the crew noticed that the oil pressure for the left engine had dropped to 20 psi. A thorough check revealed that there were no other instrument warnings or visual or auditory indications that could confirm an oil problem. The emergency checklist required that the engine be shut down, but the captain elected to conduct some further investigation. During this time, all three were preoccupied with the problem, and no one was visually monitoring the progress of the flight. Furthermore, reflection from a cabin light used to read the emergency checklist impaired vision through the windscreen, while an open mic in the cabin added to the ambient noise level. Shortly afterwards, the flight ran into severe turbulence. Snowfall could be seen in the running lights as the aircraft began to lose altitude, with airspeed oscillating between 70 and 90 knots. Several audio and visual warnings of an impending stall went off. The passenger suddenly pointed out terrain ahead to the left. The co-pilot blindly banked 30 degrees to the right, and then to the left, adding power in flaps, narrowly clearing the crest of two peaks. They climbed quickly and broke cloud cover at 7,000 feet, 20 miles from their course line. It is a sobering thought that an aircraft was almost flown into a mountain because the crew became distracted by a faulty instrument, completely losing their situational awareness. The weak situational awareness elements were spatial orientation and cockpit resource management. Departure from standard operating procedures combined with abnormal oil pressure readings led to unresolved discrepancies which became a fixation. That resulted in no one looking. This was only a close call, yet it had the exact same ingredients as the much publicized Everglades accident in which more than 100 people died. It isn't necessary to hold a pilot's license to recognize the statistical risk. This policy does not cover any accident occurring while operating or serving as the member of a crew of any aircraft. Of course, like all professionals, you carry a life insurance policy from an underwriter who specializes in aviation. Ongoing situational awareness is also a policy, one we hope you will always carry with you as well.